Is your podcast designed for prospecting or for partnerships?
When we are reaching out to guests, we're typically reaching out to companies we'd like to work with. We have found that to not work great. What we found it works really well is more for deals in progress. It's a credibility factor that really helps to grease deals. Okay, the other value that I try to socialize inside the company is I think every single person in the company should be listening to the episodes because these are people who are like our customers, telling them how they think about frictionless experiences. So the engineers need to hear that. The customer success team needs to hear that.
That is a fascinating take on the use of a podcast as a listening tool. Hey, Chuck, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here.
So what would you say is your claim to fame in the world?
Let's see. Beyond the obvious stuff that's in my LinkedIn profile, like the fact that I've been a 6-time SaaS CMO and author of a book, An Audience of One, over my shoulder here. I guess I'll go with this one. Always gets people. For people who know the giant Citgo sign in Boston above the ballpark, I worked on Citgo they were my client. So I managed their advertising when I was with an agency. And I had the opportunity once to go up. It's on the top of the Boston University bookstore building and actually turn the Citgo sign off. And there was a game going on in the stadium. And as soon as I turned it back on, the crowd roared. I don't think they were related, but it was kind of fun.
Yeah, I love that. When you do an action, you're like, ooh, got a reaction, but I don't know if that was me.
I'll take credit.
Well, what are we going to talk about today? You run a podcast with one of your clients currently.
Just for perspective, we're over 2 years in. We're episode 57, I want to say. We worked with a top production company to build it out initially, and today we do it a little more scrappy.
A little more scrappy than you originally started. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, again, I didn't know the first thing about doing podcasting. So when I started, I went out and talked to 2 or 3 of the big production companies. And we went with one of them, and they really did help us in nailing down the name, the logo, the look, the feel, all that kind of stuff. And so we worked with them for probably the first 18 months and producing episodes. And we had a, producer would come on the episodes and do all the stuff. It was great with the full service, but it was expensive. After 18 months, once we now knew a lot about the podcast world, I went back out and I get this comment occasionally. Why can't you just record something and throw an AI? For the way we do the podcast, that would not work. Our guests, we're bringing in top executives from the industry. They sometimes say things they shouldn't say, or they don't like the way they said it. They want to re-say it, things like that. So there's a lot of editing and stuff that goes into it. And so anyway, the point of all that is we do use a production team, but we use a scrappier production team. That's a couple of younger guys that are a little less experienced. And we've brought down the cost dramatically on what it costs us to produce the podcast.
Yeah, it's an interesting note. It doesn't get talked about a lot is when you run a podcast, depending on your audience, you have, I'm doing my podcast now. We're 25 episodes into this podcast. I did 12 of a previous niche in a previous life. And that's one of the things I noticed. If someone's, for example, they're an ideal prospect, or in my case, I have a lot of ideal referral partners on my podcast, such as yourself. And if they're on and they're not used to being on camera, or it's been a while, and they make a flub, they want to know they have the security of removing that. And what that does, I found when I tell folks that and they know that, and it happens all the time, it makes it a safer place. And a safer place leads to better conversation, in my opinion. Which is ironic because a lot of people assume podcasts have to be like as au naturel as possible, but there's a balancing act.
But to your point, I think that makes it more natural. I think it's one of the other things we learned early on was we don't give guests the questions in advance, because what we found is they have prepared answers and would come across very stilted, sound very, and so we never give the guests the questions in advance so that we get them kind of thinking off on their feet. And then between that and the fact that we will edit, they feel very comfortable.
There's a lot of things you've learned doing 50 episodes. You're ahead of me. What's something else you learned doing a podcast?
So what we find helpful, and I know we didn't do it in the case of yours, you're a professional doing this, but what we find helpful when we're interviewing people who have not been on podcasts before very often is we always do a prep call. And for us, what we do is build, because our podcast is around frictionless digital experiences. There are many directions that can take, and you can talk in a lot of different angles, and it can go very technical. It can go very user experience or design, or there's a lot of different ways to think about it. So what we do is we do a prep call with the guest, and we find, because we're getting very senior execs from very large companies, typically, they need that to get comfortable. They aren't going to agree to it and book a time to record without having talked to you and understand what you do. So we find the prep calls go well. So when we're recruiting, we go out, we reach out to them. If they agree, we give them a Calendly link. They book time for a 30-minute prep call. During that, we help them understand how the podcast works. But more importantly, we ask them what they're passionate about. Tell us, kind of give us what you're doing today, where you're focused, your background, and what you're passionate about when it comes to frictionless digital experiences. And that usually what will happen is, as we start talking, they'll go off on some tangent that's super interesting. And so literally me and my co-host, and he's more the expert, we're listening and we go, hey, that would make a great episode. Let's do it around that. And we kind of do the whole thing. We record that. And then I send that to a producer who then turns it into a questionnaire. But it gives us a theme and a way to think about the episode so that we go into it knowing what we want to come out with. And the guest has an idea of what we're going to talk about, even though we haven't given them the script, so they can be thinking. And what I tell them are things like, hey, stories are really powerful. So I'm going to ask you, what's an example when you had this kind of friction? How did you solve it?
What you're saying makes a lot of sense. I could really see that working, especially if is your podcast designed for prospecting or for partnerships?
It's interesting that you asked that, because we went into it with the idea to be prospecting. And so when we are reaching out to guests, we're typically reaching out to companies we'd like to work with. We have found that to not work great. I'll be honest. We have not converted a ton to clients. In fact, I don't know that we've converted any guests to clients. We've gotten some into a sales motion, but it feels very disjointed if you get on there and you're selling. And so we've not found a great way to do it. What we found, it works really well, and the value of it is more for deals in progress. My co-host is also our head of sales engineering. So when he comes on a call with somebody who's in a sales motion already, and they're in a proof of concept, they're like, Nick, you're on the call? I've been listening to your podcast. Or if they haven't been listening to it, hey, have you heard our podcast? And they go listen to the podcast. It establishes us with expertise. It established us for interviewing top executives in the industry. And so it's a credibility factor that really helps to grease deals. And we've had deals that have closed that the podcast was a critical part of that, but they didn't start with the podcast. It wasn't a lead gen. So for us, we found it to not work great as lead gen, but much more as to support our deal process, if you will.
Like, there's certain activities you can do that seem really valuable and seem like they would be prospect getting, but for whatever reason, they're just not. But they're really good for that different part of your funnel.
And that's a hard thing sometimes for CEOs to get, because they're going, well, we're spending all this money. How many prospects has gotten us? Well, it hadn't really gotten us any prospects that we can tie directly back to the podcast, but it's helped a lot of deals. So when the salespeople hear that and they engage, and people are saying, hey, I've been listening to your podcast, all this stuff, we try to socialize that internally to make sure that that's getting back up to the executive team, so they start hearing that the podcast is proving that kind of value.
There's a case to be made for how effective is your marketing across the funnel, not just at the top.
And I know this isn't the topic of this, but I've done other podcasts all around the myth of the magic bullet or the silver bullet. There's one tactic, and CEOs say, I want to spend $100 on this and get $1,000 out here. And it just doesn't work that way in B2B buying anymore. It's a surround sound and a bunch of different things. So the podcast probably factors in that we may or may not ever know, unless we can tie that back somehow technologically to know. And we do have ways to see when they go to our podcast site and play. But if they just listen to the episode on Spotify, we have no idea. Or they go to even YouTube, we don't have a way to track that.
For me, I have no attribution metrics whatsoever. To me, it's part of my ecosystem of content. As one of our clients, Sophia Vega, calls it the content ecosystem, because I know that if the more you talk to people and the more you create content from those conversations, I know I'm bought into that already. But you're right. And for the executives who aren't necessarily marketing minded, it can be difficult to know that this is a process and it's a multi-step process.
Okay, the other value that I try to socialize inside the company is, I think every single person in the company should be listening to the episodes because these are people who are like our customers, telling them what's important to them, telling them how they think about frictionless experiences. So the engineers need to hear that. The customer success team needs to hear that. They hear it from the customers, but they hear it on the podcast in an unvarnished way because they're not talking to us from a sales standpoint. They're saying, hey, here's how we think about friction, or here's how we solve this problem. And sometimes it's even with a competitive tool. That's great insight. So I don't know how many of our employees actually do listen to it, but I wish all of them listen to every episode because I think there's tons to be learned.
That is a fascinating take on the use of a podcast as a listening tool. There's always silos, right? In a big organization, disconnect between customer needs and wants. And
Yeah. And a lot of those people don't ever get to talk to customers. They never hear directly from a customer. This is a chance, even if they're not customers, they're people like our customers because that's who we're targeting. So there's people that will give them perspective that's useful.
so knowing what you know now about how your podcast is kind of that middle of the road. I like the way you put that. It greases the wheels of the deals. The deal wheels are greased. Would you or would your co-host have jumped into a podcast knowing it wasn't effective at top of funnel activity, but knowing it would be effective at middle funnel activity?
That's an excellent question. In hindsight, I mean, I sold it in originally for the lead gen standpoint. And honestly, nobody's ever circled back and go, wait a minute, you said this, and 2 years later, this is what we've gotten. But it's always, anytime it's a budget item, it's always at risk, or there's always a question of what it's doing for you. And so that's where, again, I can't tie any one tactic typically to a sale. It takes all of those pieces, and that's very hard to quantify. That's a bigger challenge that we have.
We have that with our clients. We do short form video production. It's very hard to do attribution for video because it's part, like we've been talking about, it's part of a comprehensive set of tactics that makes the other things more effective. It's not, and like you hinted at earlier, it's not a magic bullet activity. But a lot of people do expect it because they've been hearing about video for a decade. And by the time they start working with us, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm finally doing the thing everyone's been talking about for a decade. Surely it must be magical. It's not. That's not how it works. It goes back to this conversation we're having in marketing. I think even more now with all the attribution metrics dying. Like you either believe it's valuable or you don't. It's like a belief and it's not even a quantifiable. What's your take on that? Because it's something I've struggled with a lot, not just with our clients, but knowing that this is a constant, I'll say barrage against the effectiveness of marketing is show me the money, show me the numbers.
What I'm focused on and what we're measuring is ultimately pipeline. That's what the CEO cares about. CEO doesn't care about MQLs and SQLs and leads and all that stuff, even though almost every CEO I talk to says we need more top of funnel leads. I get that. That's like the number one thing I hear on prospect calls. And what I tell them is you don't need leads. What you need are qualified people who know about you and are interested in you and ultimately want to engage with you. To get there in a B2B world, the way people buy in a B2B world with multi-stakeholders, with multi-solutions, with very often I'm selling solutions that are very large ticket prices. So the sales cycle might be 6-9 months. They need to hear about it in a number of different ways and start to be exposed to it. And you've got to show them how you're solving a problem. And that takes, the data tells us something like 65 engagements before they're willing to talk to a salesperson. They want to do all the research. They want a bunch of awareness. And so that's why you can't do one thing and expect that they're going to get there. They need to see it, and it's going to take time. And so we do have ways to measure that, in that we can see among our ICPs, if they're visiting our website once, if they're engaging multiple times, we can see if they're engaging with our LinkedIn content. There's ways that we can tell that. And so we get early signs, but what they ultimately care about is pipeline. So I focus people on pipeline, and I set the expectation. If we start today, it's going to be 90 days before you're starting to see people even coming in, because it's going to take that long. And so if you don't have that patience, don't go down this route.
Yeah, because by the time they become aware of you, they get those touch points, they have the first call with your team, then that's when the clock ticks on the sales cycle. So you got to add the sales cycle to the time it takes for all the touch points to build up to. There's 2 timelines together.
It does. It does. And it's just unfortunately the way B2B buying is today, and the fact that buyers don't want to engage with the salesperson early. They want to do 90% of the research. And there's also data. I just read a study this week that something like 91% of B2B buyers already have at least one solution in mind when they start a sales process, when they are a buying process. Once they've got budget or they've got identified that as a need, they've been out there because they've been on LinkedIn, they've been listening to podcasts, they've been doing all these things and hearing about solutions. I know personally, I have listened to podcasts for companies. I have heard about solutions a year and a half before before I had an opportunity to actually get into a buying cycle, because I just didn't have budget. I didn't have the right client. I didn't have all that. And so if I hadn't figured that stuff out a year in advance, when it comes time to it, I'm not just going out and Googling going, who does this? I need this. I've already got 1 or 2 companies I'm talking to. If you come along at that point, great opportunity. That was a lucky strike. But the reality is I've already got somebody in mind by the time I get to that point.
Which brings us back to the podcasting, because it is about what you're talking about. If your idea is I have to get in front of my buyers and then stay in front of my buyers, that means therefore that he who has the best systems to do that wins.
Yeah. And it factors into the new SEO and the AI search, where you're starting to get featured on other sites and by other people out there. That factors into your credibility. So it serves a bigger purpose. You get the content from it, you get the YouTube channel, you get all the other components of it, but it's part of an overall play. And it's kind of like investing in public relations or analyst relations. For certain industries and certain companies, it's appropriate, but it's not the first thing you do. If you are desperate and you just need the phone to ring and you need that, then there's stuff you could do that's going to be much closer to bottom of the funnel to get the people who are already in market, et cetera, and pick those people off than analyst relations or public relations. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're up here. They're not heat and they're not food, and shelter. They're self-actualization, things like that. A podcast is somewhere in the middle. Podcast is not, if you only have budget to do one thing, you don't do a podcast.
I tell that to people with the video thing, because there's a lot of overlap between short form video and podcast in terms of the pain point to solve. If this is your first spend on, it's not the first spend you want. You want to invest in the high stakes one-on-one conversations as much as possible versus one-on-many. So get better at sales activities than marketing activities if you're tight, and then add marketing to the mix. Make your sales more effective.
One thing we have started doing, and I don't have a way of knowing if it's working, but I suspect it is based on seeing traffic and stuff, is we started inserting a commercial. We've all had a commercial from day one. It was recommended by a podcast production company, just a commercial break in the middle, but it was just about the company in general. Well, by the way, I steal ideas from everybody. So I listened to tons of podcasts. I was listening to guys who had built a very successful podcast, and I noticed they had a content offer as their thing. Hey, are you planning for 2026? Get our guide to blah, 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 blah. Go to, a URL/guide. And so that's what we started doing. We now run content offers in the podcast where we pitch a particular ebook or a guide or a planning tool or something like that. And I think that's going to prove effective. Again, it's hard to tell, but I think that's a great way. If you are listening to the podcast, you go, I've never heard of this company, but I like what they're talking about. I like kind of their expertise they're sharing. And then you hear this, let me go check out that offer. That's a low risk, and we ungate our content. So let me go check it out. And we even pitch that in the commercial. We say, hey, it's ungated. Don't have to give us your email address. Go check it out. So I can do that, and I don't have to engage with a salesperson. I don't have to take that kind of risk. It's a great way to move beyond the podcast to take the next step to learn more.
That's another piece of free content. You're trying to maximize those touch points to get to the sale versus you're trying to get their email. People won't release their email that soon in the process if they just learned about you. It totally makes sense. Well, Chuck, this has been a really good conversation. I've learned a few things from my podcast and the way I approach things. Couple great tips there. I tell folks all the time I do my podcast because it's like getting free consulting. So thank you so much for that. Where can people learn more about you?
Sure. Best place is probably LinkedIn. I try to post a couple times a week on there. If you want to ever engage with me, just reach out to me on there. Or I have a website, chuckmoxley.com, or I have the book if you want to check out my book. It's called An Audience of One. It's all about one-to-one marketing, published by McGraw-Hill. It's available on Amazon and wherever you buy your books.
Beautiful. Well, Chuck, thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here.